Hey, we're back, and I'm your host, BKP. Good morning from the office, North Georgia's only live online morning show. And voters out there in Georgia, are you going to the polls and you're looking at these 5 constitutional amendments on the ballot, and you're wondering to yourself, hey, what are these about, and how do you really feel about it? And sometimes the way the amendment's written on your ballot to vote is not exactly really what's happening there or what it's really about. That's my opinion. But joining me now is someone that's done a lot of work and research on this, political columnist Jessica Szilagyi with allongeorgia.com. Jessica, how are you this morning?
Good. How are you this morning?
Great. Now, I want to, a lot of people have been asking me over and over to do a segment on the Georgia State constitutional amendments, which are 5 right now listed, and I have not had the time to do thorough research, but in reading over a lot of articles, I think you've done, I just want to tell you, you've done a very good job outlining them, putting them into an easy form for people to look up and read and make their own decision as a voter. But you wrote a one article of why you're voting no. So let's start there on Amendment 4, what's called Marsy's Law, Victims' Rights. And for those at home, you're starting to see a lot of commercial campaign for this. But Jessica, you wrote an article why you're voting no for this. So let's discuss this one first.
Okay. Well, just to dive right in, this went through the legislature this year. It's a nationally funded campaign that's been kind of taking hold across the nation. It's backed by Marsy's brother. Marsy was murdered by, I guess, an ex-boyfriend or something similar of the sort. But basically what it does is it gives victims additional rights and puts them in constitutional form so they have a recourse when those rights are violated. And it sounds like a great idea. Of course, we all want to be pro-victim, but the problem with this amendment in the highest regard is that it deals with alleged perpetrators, and it actually gives more rights to the victims ahead of the legal process. It gives them more say and the opportunity to decline certain things ahead of any type of due process for an offender. And my biggest concern, while all of the proponents of this amendment have said, well, we already do this, we're just making it constitutional. I mean, that's a huge step to go from statute and, something that can be opted in with prosecutors and victims to something that is ingrained in our Constitution and will probably never be undone.
A couple things you said in that, Jessica, is I want to say the big step from a referendum to a constitutional amendment, that you're amending the Constitution. And anytime I go into the ballot, go in to cast a ballot, I think about very strongly the words, the Georgia Constitution, and amending it. That's a big deal, opening that, because we all know what has to happen to amend the United States Constitution, and how difficult it is to do that, to make sure we're doing the right thing and amending the Constitution. So one for me, just the fact that you're amending the Constitution, you really should take that serious in your vote and look up what you're doing. Second, you said this a couple times. I want you to elaborate on it a little. You said alleged and ahead of due process. So what does this? Can you elaborate a little more on that and what your concerns are there?
Sure. So basically, the language that is in the amendment and in the preamble of the amendment and in the actual legislation that enabled this amendment to be on our ballot is that these victims have the right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. And, of course, I don't believe that's the role of the Constitution, to give someone a right to be treated a certain way. But basically, the proceedings that have to do with an alleged criminal, the victims would have a right to be heard at any proceedings, which could be, before an actual trial. They have something to deal with, like at bond hearings, before release, at pleas, at sentence. And all of that, an actual offender doesn't always have the right to be heard or in an extensive way at those hearings. The victim would have kind of a leg up, and law enforcement officials and some of the prosecutors in the state have actually spoken out about how they're concerned that it can slow the legal process down because, right now there's a certain time period in which you have to do certain things for offenders to not be violating their rights. And when you have to include victim notification, not just by opt-in, which is what we have right now, but instead by mandate that the case cannot go forward until the victim has been notified and things like that, it could slow the process down considerably, and that's not something that we need no matter what corner of the state you're in, because our justice system is already slow.
All right, yeah. Well, ahead of due process, and I guess if I'm looking at it, because the commercials, where do you feel the commercials? Because if you're watching the commercials out there, and you're going to go vote today, and you're just getting ready to leave the house, and you watch the commercial, you're thinking, how can I be against this? I mean, who's against the victim? My words, but do you feel some of these commercials are a little misleading or not telling the whole story? And what do you see in these commercials that may concern you, the information they're giving the voters?
I absolutely think they're misleading. I mean, they're very well done. They're well funded. The gentleman who's behind them, I think his name is Henry Nicholas. He spent $27 million on these initiatives in 6 states before he even got to Georgia. We don't even know how much he spent on Georgia. So, of course, they are great commercials. They're real victims. They're real stories, and so you're sensitive to that. But to imply that, victims do not have rights when the rights are already instilled in our judicial system that has been in place for as long as our country has been around, and we cater to victims. We have victims advocates office, and we have, systems in place through law enforcement and the district attorney's office when we have these violent crimes. It is misleading to say that it's time for equal rights of victims. What this law is actually advocating for is more than equal rights for victims and tilting the scales in their favor away from the offender. And that's an unpopular position to take. I mean, that's been the main criticism. Oh, how can you be against victims? Or how can you be, in favor of someone who committed a crime? Well, we're just in favor of somebody who allegedly committed a crime because it's not convicted. The language in the amendment is alleged.
We're very concerned at anything that takes away due process. And that's just the bottom line for me. If it takes away due process and alleged is there and it tilts the scales, that's my concern. And again, you have the feeling of how can you be against how can you be against this, the victim? But that is it for me, taking away from due process. One other subject on this, and this actually applies to all 5 of the amendments, is the way the language is written on the ballot versus the actual amendment itself. Do you have concern with when voters go and see some of the language and the way it's written, Jessica?
Yes. I mean, this one is pretty brief, so I don't have as much concern. I mean, it's not as misleading as some of the others, but in the first, it's only one sentence, and it says, so as to provide certain rights to victims against whom a crime has been allegedly perpetrated, and to allow victims to assert rights. I mean, that's a hard thing to say no to, and if you haven't done your research, of course you want victims to have rights. So what's frustrating, what I would love to see, is for somebody who's against the bill to be the one to help write the language, because the people who are pushing the bill, of course, they're going to craft the language of the amendment to get the end result they want, which is to have Marcy's Law be a constitutional amendment in our state. And what's even more interesting, and a lot of people don't know, is that this campaign that's taking hold across the nation, they want an amendment to our U.S. Constitution. They've made that clear. It's been in the newspapers in Iowa and I think Montana and some other places, but they want a U.S. constitutional amendment. So they're not going to stop, and they're going to continue to kind of twist this message to advance their agenda any way they can.
So I don't ask about people's vote, but you wrote it, so you're voting no on this.
I am voting no on this.
All right. Well, I don't really push to ask people how they vote on things, but you actually wrote a column saying that, so I didn't think you would mind. Now, which one would you like to look at next? I'd like to briefly get your opinion of all five, but which is the second one on the list of five that you have the most concern or you want to comment about?
Well, I think Amendment 2, which creates a business court, is of great concern, not for any other reason that the judges are going to be appointed and not elected and accountable to the people, and they'd be appointed by the governor. And, it's right now, especially not knowing who our governor is going to be come January, you don't know who's going to be the person that's going to oversee these business deals, and it's supposed to make for a more friendly business environment. It's been endorsed by the Georgia Chamber and a bunch of other organizations, but when you're dealing with something that is so volatile and so I guess vulnerable to who's going to be the governor, I don't want a whole new court system created.
And this is just that, Jessica. It's a new court system, totally new court system that's going to be created. And let me ask you this: are you aware of what the system is going to look like? How many judges? How they're going to structure it? Is that anything that you have seen, or anything that the public could look at?
I'm sorry, it cut out a little. Could you say that?
Yeah, What I was saying is, yes, it is. It's going to be a whole new court system, and you're correct about that. And people need to think about that. But has there been any information released on how the court system would be set up, structured, how many judges, where the districts would be, and how it would function? Is there any information concerning how this new court system would work?
No, there hasn't. And I actually linked to the original bill in the article I wrote because I wanted people to be able to see that this is like an approval of an idea. And
right.
They created, there's some rules about the state court and the term length and the qualifications for being a judge in this business court. But in terms of, other than it would be in a superior court and it would deal with business, and handle business disputes, there's not any parameters, which, again, going back to what we were just talking about, the Constitution is a huge deal. And when you amend it and you're going to add something new to it, it should be concrete and clear and not subject to political persuasion as fluctuates every 4 to 8 years.
Well, I'm gonna step out and say I totally disagree with this one for that reason alone. And I like the way you put it, and you hit it exactly the way I'm thinking. They want you to approve ideas of a court system and change our Constitution to reflect that. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Present us the whole entire court system, how it looks, how the judicial qualifications go, the recommendations, how many's on the court, where these courts are at, and what kind of actual cases you will be hearing, then ask me to vote. How about that?
Absolutely. And, this was something that was part of Governor Deal's Court Reform Council that he's pushed, and we've seen a great success with the veterans courts and the drug courts, but this is a little bit different. When you start dealing with businesses, it's a combination of people and businesses and business ideas and individual. Is it just people who are in corporations? Is it people who are sole proprietorships? You're going to get into it's going to be confusing for people who actually have to use the system. And like you said, we know nothing about it. And what talking about the language, if I may, really quick, it says in order to lower costs, improve the efficiency of all courts, and promote predictability of judicial outcomes. Well, the first two, of course, people want lower costs and efficiency, but do we want to promote the predictability of judicial outcomes? Are we creating a court system so we'll know what the rulings will be when you file a case in that court system? To me, that's a flag in itself.
Well, you know what? I have to agree with you on that because I've listened to the arguments, or I've listened to the opposing side talk about the backlog in our court system, our superior court system throughout the state of Georgia, which we know in our district, the backlog, and these businesses are getting caught in so many other things that are happening in our court system. So they advocate pulling it out will speed up the cases that are backlogged. So they give it an appearance that this is a real positive. And, let me just say this for argument's sake. Maybe it is a positive, but you haven't shown me what you want to do. So to make a decision on what you think will be a positive in the court system of Georgia, lay out to me what it looks like, then let me make the decision.
I agree. And, I'm not a fan of mandates or more regulation, but I feel like when we have these amendments on the ballot, there should be some sort of obligation to present a model of, what we're voting on and how that will be instituted. I don't understand why they're banking on a lack of information and people not understanding. I mean, this one is, I think, 6 lines worth of question just to get to, do you want to do this? And we still don't know what it is. So they came up with more words than what we actually know it will do just to ask the question.
This doesn't apply to so many people that I don't know how many will actually just go in and pull a lever, not knowing what it creates or the outcome. Amendment 1, portion of the revenue from outdoor recreation equipment sales tax dedicated to land conservation fund amendment. What say you on that one?
This one, it's not, like you said, it's not going to affect as many people, but you have to wonder why this is on our ballot. Why do we want to redirect a system that has seemingly worked for years and years and years? You're in North Georgia. Have you heard?
No, I don't know what's broken that we needed to do something. And I always wonder, thank you for asking, because I see this and I wonder to myself, what is not working that we don't know about, that it's important enough to have a constitutional amendment? Who feels this is important? And I agree with you, and I haven't had time to look behind it, but I don't know who feels this is important or what has happened that's not working.
I was at a county commission meeting where they were talking about this, because it will, without a doubt, affect how the revenue is collected. And they were saying that there's just a large timber company that's behind it that wanted, to know what to expect across different counties. And so what's going to happen, instead of the money going directly to the county tax assessor, will go to the Department of Revenue and be dispersed back out. And we know how that works usually. It's just like when we send our gas tax to the feds. They take a little off the top and send a little less back. And so for me, no, this doesn't affect me. I don't have any timberland, but I'm concerned about the why, and I don't see a need for it when the counties have been handling this for so long. But to clarify for people who may be confused about what it is, the purpose is so that if you own land, a big piece of property, and it overlaps into 2 lands or 2 counties, your tax value will be the same, and you'll pay the same percentage of taxes.
Let me move to Amendment 5, school sales tax referendum. I'm a little confused on exactly what that's wanting to accomplish there. Can you clear me up on that? Because I've read this and I'm a little confused on what they're trying to do there.
So this one is probably without a doubt the most confusing, especially because it deals with areas where there's a city school district and a county district in the same area. So like Atlanta City Schools and Fulton County. But basically it allows for them to impose another E-SPLOST or SPLOST tax for up to 5 years and up to 1%. And they don't have to, basically they can assess the tax on everyone, but they don't have to share it with the districts that are included. So it's a tax increase. People would be voting for a tax increase. And what they say it is supposed to do is to keep either the smaller district from being overtaken by the bigger district, or the bigger district running all over the smaller district. And while that's a noble cause, seemingly, the majority of these areas where there's a county and a school or a city school district aren't struggling for money, or they aren't struggling for tax revenue from property taxes, because they usually have two school districts because they have a large population. So to me, they've probably already have a high millage rate, and they just want to have another sales tax.
Okay, I'm with you. When I get done with it, it's funny you said that, because when I get done with it, my thought is they just want to get another sales tax is all I can see out of it, and I don't quite understand it, and I think it's very confusing. Now, I will say this, for a constitutional amendment, Amendment 5 is a school sales tax referendum amendment. This amendment, if passed, would allow school districts or groups of school districts within the county to call for a sales and use tax referendum. For example, Fulton County. So I don't know. I don't think we've got years before we're going to have, probably never, a Gilmer County city school system and a Gilmer County system, or a city school system. You know what I mean? So I don't quite understand this one. I'm just going to be upfront. I don't understand this one, and I don't know who's pushing this and why this needs to be on the ballot. So, what other comments? Which ones did we gloss over? You want to go back to? You want to make sure we say things about some of them. Which one's there? You've got any other comments on any of the 5?
Well, the amendment one, I think, is an important one to just touch on, because it's something that's, again, already in place, much like Marcy's law. This is already a tax, and
Yes.
They make that very clear. The first sentence is, without increasing the current sales tax rate, and it's a tax on outdoor equipment. And I think that it's well intended, but again, it's, to me, if it was just a law, I would support it, because they're requiring the money to be dedicated that initially was in the bill. But my problem with this one is that it's, again, so loose for a constitutional amendment. It says that it gives the state authority to dedicate up to 80%. So they could dedicate 5% to this fund and still be in compliance with the constitutional amendment, when the intention is for 80%. And we know that to be true because it was 100% when the initial law was passed. And so this doesn't have any meat to it. I understand and appreciate why all the outdoor people want this to pass, because they want money to go to the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Fund, but it's not strong enough. It should say it shall dedicate 80% of the sales tax from these goods, not up to 80%, because then you're just giving the government the ability to dedicate however much money they want, and that's the exact opposite of what a constitution is supposed to do. The Constitution is supposed to restrict the government, not the people or anything the people put in place.
Let me ask you a question. Overall, for me, some of these things on the ballot are not bad laws, or are things we need to look further into. But to me, they just don't cross the level of being constitutional amendments, and that's what gets it for me. Are you seeing that kind of the same way?
I do, and for some reason, we have constitutional amendments on our ballot seemingly every year, every time this comes around, and people, I feel like this year, I'm hoping they seem more awake to the idea that this is a big deal, and some of these things are very loosely written. And so I'm just hoping that people will pause and say, it might be a good idea, like you said, but does it need to be a constitutional amendment? Can we go back to the legislature and think about this a little bit more?
Let me ask you, now I know you said you're voting no on 4. Do you want to share your which way you plan to go on any of the other amendments, or leave it at that?
I don't mind sharing. I kind of have touched on it, but I'm against all of them because none of them meet that threshold
I kindly picked that up. I just didn't want to. I wanted to let you do it. Okay. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. I didn't want you to think I don't catch on or anything.
Well, they just threshold, and this is a very big deal, and it will last forever. And if the legislature wants to jam it down our throats next year, if we reject them all, then we can hold them accountable for doing that. But I don't think the people should willingly amend our Constitution to be some loosely written document.
Before we close, you are following the races, the state races here in Georgia, very close. I know you are. I read several of your articles. How do you feel about recent polling that says Brian Kemp, the Republican, and Democrat Stacey Abrams are in a statistical tie? How do you see that race, and how do you see that polling right now?
I think that this is going to be a lot closer than Governor Deal and Jason Carter a few years ago, and I'm expecting a nail-biter, at least in that race. I don't know if it's a statistical tie. I'm kind of in an echo chamber in southeast Georgia. We're very conservative down here, and it seems to be Kemp country without a doubt. But I think it's going to be a lot closer, and the turnout and the absentee ballot requests and the spikes across the board in early voting on the first day, it's a big deal, and I think it's going to have a huge impact because I don't think that's just day one. I think it's going to stay like that for the next 2.5 weeks. So, all
right, let me double down on the echo chamber, because where you're at in the echo chamber, I am direct opposite of the state, but in the same echo chamber. We're in an area where I say I think the county I'm in, 86%. Voted for Donald Trump, the county surrounding us, and we're an average of 82 that vote Republican. I, for one, feel that rural Georgia will win this election. If Brian Kemp wins the election, it'll be in rural Georgia. He has to have big numbers to try to do a little overcoming in the metro areas. So do you think in the echo chamber where you're at, it's going to be strong enough for him and the turnout is going to happen? What say you?
I do. I feel strongly that they are going to turn out. The people are fired up right now. I think the stuff from the national level has really trickled down to keep people engaged. And I'm seeing a lot of people that aren't traditionally political coming out and taking a stand and encouraging people to vote, not just mouthing off about issues, but telling people why it's important to vote and why it matters. And even when I don't agree with their reasons, or I may not agree with even who they're voting for, it's been interesting to see how many people are truly engaged this election cycle. And I was a little concerned after the primary because we got a little bit of a slow start, it seemed like, of engagement. But all of a sudden, everyone is truly angry about the positions of the people who they don't agree with, and they're ready to take it to the polls.
Okay, any other of the state races from Lieutenant Governor down that you would like to comment on before we close?
I think that we're going to see the traditional drop-off of voters as we go down the race, but I'm really excited to see what happens in the Secretary of State's race because we have John Barrow, who was actually the congressman in my district for several years, and he's represented so many people during his tenure, and I think that he's going to add a different dynamic to the Democrat because he is a blue dog Democrat. He is a moderate. He knows a lot of people and he has constituent service relationships. And so I think if there's any race where you're going to see a true crossover, it's going to be that one. And then you couple that with turnout. I'm just eager to see what's to come.
My prediction has been that the Republicans in the state of Georgia will not hold every constitutional office after this election. Which one? I don't know, but that may be the one because you're in an echo chamber and Brad Raffensperger cannot afford a strong Kemp area to vote Kemp and then switch over and vote John Barrow and win in Metro Atlanta. So I don't know. We may be right. We may be wrong. Jessica, I want to thank you so much. Is Szilagyi? Did I get that correct?
Close enough.
We'll tell you, all right, I apologize. I really do. Political writer for allongeorgia.com. Hey, listen, I love your work, and I hope I'm going to be in touch with you. I hope to have you back real soon, okay?
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, now we're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we're going to have Dr. Markwell. You've a lot of talk about vaping, okay? And we have Dr. Markwell is going to be with us, and we're going to talk about vaping right after this commercial, and then I'm going to have a closer for the day. I hope that was helpful, Georgia voters. Right after these messages, Dr. David Markwell.